This is Steve Warrenkamp from Warrenkamp Well Control Training. We're going to have a little talk today about tubing hangers by my good buddy and PIC of longstanding up in the Rocky Mountains, Mark Abbott. Very knowledgeable about workover operations and in particular has a passion for making sure we avoid problems with tubing hangers. There's moments of exposure to be aware of for sure. So listen to what Mark has to say. So tell me what you think about tubing hangers and the things that you've seen in the field.
Okay. So I feel like, the tubing hanger and the lockdown pins are something that have not really been talked about a lot in our industry, especially with our rig crews. There's a lot of things that can go wrong with installing, landing a hanger, locking it down, the lockdown pins, as well as the gland nuts. And essentially what we're talking about here is a lot of guys don't understand that the hanger itself is an actual barrier, and that's why it has the elastomer around there. And again, guys, elastomer is just a fancy word for rubbers. Okay. Understanding that the hanger is in fact a barrier because it does keep us or protect us from the backside, which is the annulus between the casing and the tubing. Having said, a lot of guys don't understand that the lockdown pins itself are an actual barrier. It's a two-part system. So if my fist is the gland nut and this is the actual lockdown pin itself, essentially what we're talking about here is this gland nut and this pin are a two-part system that are installed into the flange of the wellhead itself, which is a barrier between that tubing pressure and the outside of this lockdown pin. Now, what a lot of guys don't understand as well is inside this gland nut, this pin has what's called packing, and it looks like sometimes rope or even some like green grease inside of there as well. But in fact, this is a barrier system. Now, what I always ask guys is, and we're not taught this, how many turns do I need to give to this gland nut before I start moving this pin to unland the hanger? Well, a lot of guys will say, well, maybe 2 rounds or 3 rounds. Some guys even say a quarter round. Well, the real answer is we need to move this as little as possible until the pin actually starts to move. And the reason for that is behind this gland nut that goes into the flange itself, there are quite a bit of threads. The problem with the design of this is that because it's seeing the pressure, it's also seeing any type of moisture. So a lot of times these threads are in fact rusted out. So the more that we move this gland nut, we run the risk of the gland nut actually falling off, which now we have no barrier. Having said that, once we get this to move and we get the pin to come out, then we move it all the way out. Now, I always ask everybody in the group, can we completely remove the pin? And the answer to that is no. There's a design inside here where there's a lip where this pin will only move out so far and then it will stop. Once we get that done, then we need to lock down the gland pin again, or the gland nut. And the reason for that is while we're pulling out of the hole, usually our BOPs are moving side to side. That will actually make this go ahead and rotate back out until it finally falls out. Or worst case scenario, it starts to back out. We start to get a little pressure and it will shoot out of the wellhead, injuring or killing someone. Okay, so once we've got the pin all the way pulled out and we've locked down the gland nut, we're good to go. But how do we know that this pin is all the way out? Well, one way we can do it is when we pull the wellhead off, we can visually look and make sure that those pins are all the way out. We don't ever want to put our fingers inside there. We know that. Having said that, once we go and land the hanger back, we've got to run these back in. So the same process. We're going to just barely move this gland nut as much as we can until we get this all the way in and it's engaged. Once we do that, we lock this down. Now, a lot of guys don't realize there's a reason why there is a square peg on this pin and not something else. It's designed for a crescent wrench. Well, everybody says, well, a 12-inch crescent wrench isn't going to pull that out. You're right, it's not. So we need to get a bigger crescent wrench. The one thing we do not want to do is we do not want to put any type of a pipe wrench on here because we galled those four shoulders.
I've seen
And the
that.
next rig
Yeah,
crew that comes in,
yeah. I've
sorry,
seen that. I've seen them use a monkey wrench on it rather than a crescent. So, and of course,
absolutely. And the problem with that
they
is
mess it up.
yeah, it's scalded, and you can no longer get anything on here to actually remove it, which is now that is a bad barrier, and we need to get this replaced, which it takes a lot more, guys, to replace these than you would think. We've got to go pull tubing, we've got to set a packer or any type of barrier, release all the pressure, pull the whole system out and replace it. So don't ever put any type of a pipe wrench or anything else on this. This is always designed for a crescent wrench. Other than that, guys, understand that this is a two-type barrier or two-system barrier. It's got packing on the inside as well as the gland nut itself locking everything down. Make no mistake, there is pressure behind this. Even when the well is dead, you can still have trap pressure, and that trap pressure could cause this to eject from the flange, causing a major issue.
So, Mark, now that being said, do we use any type of barrier in the tubing while we're doing this?
So that's an interesting question. Technically speaking, when you're thinking about where you're at in the operation, if we do have, let's say we're going to nipple up on the well, we need to put our BOPs on. Typically, we'll put a back pressure valve inside the tubing hanger and then bleed all that pressure off, which now we can check for zeros and make sure there are absolutely no pressure behind that gland nut.
Okay, now everything going fine is great. How long does that operation typically take?
Well, it really depends on how well trained your rig crew is. Once you guys get really moving and you start getting into the operation, by the time that you have tested your BOPs and you're ready to nipple up, by the time that you get your tree off and you get your BOPs on, you're going to minimize that moment of exposure to about 5 to 15 minutes at most. Some rig crews don't have all this stuff laid out on the base beam, including your bolts, your nuts, and any other type of equipment that you'll be installing on top of that well. We need to make sure that everything is laid out, ready to go, so that when we do pull the tree off, there's very minimal time between pulling the tree and putting the BOPs on.
Now there is a potential to run into problems mounting that tubing hanger and then getting all those bolts and nuts in place and that they're fresh, not reused. We both know that's not always the case. So what do they have to look for when they're mounting that thing and then tightening it down?
So a lot of times what I would do is if I knew that we were going to have issues with the wellhead bolts, then we'd obviously go ahead and kill the well, and then we would take our time with the bolts. If we had to do a re-kill, then that's fine. You can do that. But most times what we would do is if we were able to get all the bolts off and we did run into a little bit of issue, I had a little 2 foot pup joint with a stabbing valve on top of that so that when we remove the tree, we can install that into a hanger with the valve open. And that way we didn't build any pressure in the event that there was some pressure. But at the same time, it was cheap insurance. So by the time we either got the BOPs off the back of a trailer or even off a stump on the base beam, by the time we brought it to the actual wellhead and we hung the 4 bolts that would go above the valves on the casing valves, then I could go ahead and just pull the pup joint in the valve, put the BOPs on. But in the meantime, if we did have a bigger or a longer moment of exposure, we had some type of a barrier inside that hanger.
Obviously. And of course, you've got to remove that puck joint to be able to mount the BOPs correctly, right? And then you have the
That's
same
correct.
issue of making sure that that's bolted down properly and the right sequencing and torquing. Mark, this is always
Yeah.
great stuff. I love it. So I really appreciate you giving us time to do this. And I hope you have a great day.